Thank you so much for joining us. We're here for two mini keynotes on understanding suburbanization, and our plan is to have both presenters outline their work for 20 minutes, and then we will have discussion and questions after both of the keynotes. So we have two presenters, Pablo Mendez and Mabin. Pablo Mendez earned his doctorate in geography from the University of British Columbia in 2011, and he has served as a postdoctoral researcher on the Global Suburbanisms project, and he is now assistant professor of global systems at Carleton University. His work focuses on urban and suburban metropolitan structure and housing markets, and his published work has appeared in Population, Space, and Place, the Journal of International Migration and Integration, Environment and Planning A, the Canadian Journal of Urban Research, and, of course, a chapter in the Suburban Constellations book. So please help me welcome Pablo Mendez.
Well, thank you, Alvin. Thank you also to all of you for being here, and to Roger and the MCRI people for inviting me to give this talk. As Alvin mentioned, I'm sorry, I can't quite see people with the lights, but I'm going to pretend that there are people here. Good, I heard your laughter, so you are there. I have been involved with the MCRI as a postdoctoral fellow, as part of as a member of the benchmarking team. The benchmarking team is a small group of scholars who have been tasked with providing a quantitative profile of suburbanisms in Canada. So let me start by providing a little bit of background on this challenging task. The Global Suburbanisms project was designed essentially as a vast collaborative exercise in comparing the present suburban condition around the world. The general idea is that through comparisons of individual nations, a broad picture of the global suburban situation will emerge. There are many ways of conducting comparative research, and in the case of the Global Suburbanisms project, the approach that was proposed was to select a country that would serve as a benchmark or reference point against which the suburban condition in a large set of countries could be compared. For many reasons that will no doubt become apparent to you over the next 3 days, Canada was selected as the benchmark for the larger project. One reason for this choice is the fact that for many years, the Canadian state invested significant financial, human, and political resources in producing a rich set of quantitative, geographically structured data on its population in the form of its quinquennial census. Armed with these data, the benchmarking team set out to develop a quantitative portrait of the suburban condition in this nation. We can discuss later the implications of the federal government's decision to severely constrain the coverage of the census as of 2011, a political move that took place shortly after the Global Suburbanisms project was launched. But even before this debacle unfolded in the nation's capital, the benchmarking team knew it was walking into an empirically and theoretically complex field. Empirically, one major difficulty lied in the challenge of defining where the city ends and where the suburbs begin, and where they end as well. This is a long-standing debate that is, of course, far from settled, but a reasonable compromise has been suggested by scholars like David Gordon or Anne Forsyth, who have compellingly argued that such definitions must ultimately be geared at the specific aims behind the reasons for developing them. On the theoretical front, a crucial problem emerges from the literature that rightly questions the very notion of a city-suburb binary itself. This literature has forcefully argued not only that a clear-cut division between the urban and the suburban is empirically tenuous, but has also suggested that it is theoretically questionable given the profoundly interdependent and multinucleated structure of the contemporary metropolitan fabric, both within metropolitan areas and in an increasingly globalized context between them. These challenges encouraged us to think beyond the idea of suburbs as bounded places. To this end, we turned to the notion of suburbanisms as ways of life. Of course, there's not a definitive, unique way of doing this. Alan Watts, for example, has deftly and creatively adapted Henri Lefebvre's dialectical analysis of urbanism to the contemporary suburban condition in a brilliant theoretical paper recently published in Urban Studies, and I have no doubt that we will soon be able to see his empirical application of this important work. Our own approach is certainly in the same spirit as Watts, but it may be described as perhaps more intuitive than his own. Using data from the 2006 Canadian census, we geographically analyzed a series of variables that can be seen as representing ways of life popularly associated with a suburban mode of existence. These include various characteristics of the Canadian population, such as the propensity to live in single-family dwellings, to be part of a nuclear family household, or to rely on a private automobile, as well, among others, the propensity to live in heterogeneously middle-class neighborhoods, and to relegate one adult member of the household, typically a woman, to carry out most of the domestic labor. We applied various design strategies to map out these population characteristics at the neighborhood level, or more precisely at the census tract and dissemination area scales for Canada's largest 26 metropolitan areas. I'm going to show you some maps now, and by the way, most of the maps are available on the Atlas of Suburbanism's website, an excellent public resource developed by members of the benchmarking team. Let me take the opportunity here to thank once again Anna Kramer, Robert Walter Joseph, and Michael Seasons for the amazing work they have done on the Atlas. So I will start with 3 examples based on the use of categorical variables. In this first case, the variable is housing tenure. Our aim here was to represent the geography of a suburban way of life characterized by the homeownership ideal, and to contrast this with the geography of renting. The frequency of owner-occupied dwellings at the dissemination area level is captured by the blue dots, while the red dots represent the incidence of rented dwellings. As you can see in the case of Victoria, homeownership is much more visible as we move away from the historical center of the metropolitan area. However, we can also see that both homeowning and renting are present to varying extents throughout the region. This dual pattern is broadly observed in all 26 of the metropolitan areas in our study. The second example of categorical variable maps is for dwelling structure type. Our aim here was to map out the geography of living in detached single-family dwellings as a suburban way of life. The blue dots in this Calgary example represent the frequency of single-family dwellings at the dissemination area level, and you can see here again a decentralized pattern of low-density living, but also the incidence of both lower and higher density living occurring throughout the metropolitan area. The final example of our categorical variable maps is mode of transportation used to go to work. Using Winnipeg as my example, I want to call your attention on the one hand to the decentralized concentrations of red dots, which represent automobile commuting as a suburban way of life, and on the other hand, to the presence of all modes of commuting throughout the metropolitan area. So here again, we see the dual pattern of broad decentralization accompanied by some degree of spatial diversity. Next, I want to show an example of another approach we adopted in this project to map out suburban ways of living using 2006 census data. Here, we sought to represent the geography of detached single-family dwellings, owner-occupied dwellings, and automobile commuters by mapping the census tracts where the relative frequency of each of these 3 ways of life is above the metropolitan average. What is interesting about this approach is that it also enabled us to show where 2 or 3 of these variables occur with relative frequencies above the metropolitan rate. For example, the largest area in this map is covered in a shade of green that represents percentages above the metropolitan rate for each of the 3 variables. Finally, this other series of maps also seek to represent more than one variable for suburban ways of life at once. Here, rather than restricting ourselves to 3 variables, we employed more than 20, experimenting with principal components analysis to map out these 3 subsets of variables. The 3 subsets of variables that together express much of the total variance in the data. I don't have time to elaborate here, but I do want to highlight 2 important points that emerge from this analysis. First, these principal component maps empirically confirm the observation made by Roger, Kyle, and others that there is no single thing called suburbanism, but instead there is a plurality of suburbanisms. Based on our set of census variables alone, one form or dimension of suburbanism is captured by a first subset of variables, labeled here principal component 1. Another dimension is represented by principal component 2, and yet another one by principal component 3. Secondly, this analysis confirms the observation I repeated earlier, that while suburban ways of living are found to a large extent beyond the historic centers of metropolitan areas, they also are present to a noticeable degree in and around those centers. This analysis, in other words, provides empirical support for theoretical arguments that challenge the notion of a clear-cut division between city and the suburbs. I should mention that to make a stronger case for our visual-based findings, we have also conducted a series of regression analyses that replicate the approaches followed on these maps. I will not go through all that here, but let me simply say that this statistical work quantitatively confirms the patterns that I mentioned so far. So moving beyond a mere description of our research, I want to suggest that our findings have important implications. But in order to present these implications to you, I want to let Marcus Moos speak. Marcus is the lead on the benchmarking team, but he was not able to attend the conference for family reasons. Good family reasons, by the way, but I won't get into that. However, he put together the following short video clip to share with you the broader significance of our research.
Suburbs are now the most common form of development in Canada. It's where most people actually live. Our project is about gaining a better understanding of Canadian suburbs, as well as suburbanisms, which we define as a way of living, and we want to do this both empirically and conceptually. We used largely quantitative tools to develop indicators that help us understand the processes shaping the built form, the processes shaping land uses, and the changing demography of Canadian suburbs. One of the things that is interesting is that in North America, we seem to have developed this somewhat uneasy relationship with suburbs. Today's suburb still holds for many people these idyllic images, I think, of family life, quiet living. But at the same time, we've begun associating low-density suburbs with all sorts of health, economic, social, and environmental concerns, for example, heavy automobile reliance. This creates all sorts of tensions, and some of which we see playing out here in the GTA, where inner cities are pitched against suburbs in some ways in public discourses as either being better or worse places to raise children, better or worse to accommodate public transit, or even better or worse for economic growth, and so forth. One of the things that appears to be under the surface of this dialogue is a strict binary categorization of the metropolitan landscape. You're either depicted as a suburb or a city, one or the other. In this project, we wanted to use quantitative tools and existing data sets, and we used mainly data from the Statistics Canada census to help add more diversity to this depiction of the metropolitan landscape across Canada. And then also we were hoping that this would potentially open up new possibilities in terms of the dialogue we are having about our communities. Following Lefebvre's conceptualization of urbanism, which Alan Walks extended to suburbanisms, we started our analysis by considering urban and suburban areas, not just as different physical forms, but also as constituting different ways of living. Then when we mapped different indicators of these suburban ways of living, what we found is that these occur in what we might typically think of as both urban and suburban places. Now, the methodological and conceptual implications of this is that if we had used spatial distance from the historic downtown or period of development to define suburbs, which is often done in urban research, we would have overlooked the diversity of suburban ways of living and the diverse geographic locations these can occur. One of the really interesting findings is about intensification and the way it brings suburban ways of living, such as home ownership, downtown. This has, of course, all sorts of implications for, be it inequality, land markets, and potentially even for political affiliations exhibited in these places. That's, of course, not to suggest that central city redevelopment and suburbanization at the fringe of metropolitan areas are somehow the same things, but rather that they are both geographic manifestations of a continued promotion and cultural celebration of the home ownership ideal, which we know, of course, comes with all sorts of social privileges and particular kinds of ideologies as well. What is also intriguing is that homeownership in our analysis is most evidently associated with an income advantage as compared to other aspects of suburbanisms, which means that intensification that both implicitly and explicitly promotes homeownership has almost necessarily led to the displacement of low-income earners and will continue to do so unless it is addressed by specific housing policies. The suburbs also show greater diversity than in the past in terms of their social composition, which is partly an outcome of the suburbanization of new immigrants into ethnic enclaves in our largest metropolitan areas. We find greater diversity of housing types in the suburbs today, particularly at higher densities, although it is important to remember that Canada's suburbs long continued high-rises, of course. They were not always just composed of single-family dwellings. Now, in some cases, gentrification also appears to bring car use back downtown, although not to the extent it occurs in outlying suburbs, where car use, of course, still dominates. But even in the low-density suburbs, we see new accommodations for bicycles and transit, and this happens in part because suburbs now contain higher-density housing, more renters than in the past, and also more immigrants, which are typically associated with lower car use. There are several signs of an important transition occurring in the metropolitan landscape as a result of socioeconomic, demographic, and structural changes as well. These changes are blurring the lines between what we once thought of as the urban and the suburban, as we were finding in our research. But suburbs today are still often thought of as those places outside the central city, and I think what surprised me the most is that when we measured suburban ways of living, this dispersed image of the suburbs was actually still ringing true. Now, at the same time, we found that suburbanisms, or these ways of living, can be usefully conceptualized and measured as part of these continuums, rather than just as mutually exclusive or binary categories. And I think one of the things that's useful coming out of this research is that there's this method that can be extended to measuring all sorts of other social and economic issues in our communities. Now, empirically, we can confirm that downtown intensification does not appear to be replacing the growth of what we might call the traditional suburbanism that's characterized by single-family houses, home ownership, and even car use. These kinds of suburban ways of living are spreading to new places, and they have continued to be one of the most common forms of development in the past 30 years.
We are out of time now, or I am out of time, but as you set out to conduct the work of comparison between different countries, I hope you will feel encouraged not only to examine in traditional fashion the idea of suburbs as spatial entities, but also to explore the notion of suburbanisms as ways of life. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful overview. Just a short housekeeping note so that I ensure that we're all aware of this. If you are giving a presentation in this auditorium later on in this conference, later on today, please ensure that you get your memory keys to the AV staff early so that they can transfer this over. So for those presenting in this auditorium only, if you have memory sticks for presentations, get them to us early. Our next presenter is Alan Mabin, who is professor and head of the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He has worked in a wide variety of urban and development fields for 25 years. His most recent publications and research have focused on the relations between the public and private sectors in city development. And, of course, he has a wonderful chapter in the Suburban Constellations book. So please help me welcome Alan Mabin.
I guess I need a little clicker. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all well. I am part of a team led by myself and Robin Block, who is here somewhere, but I cannot see a thing in front of me, as has already been said by Pablo. So Robin, you could wave at the masses. Robin Block and I are the leaders of the Africa regional theme in the project. And we are working with a bunch of other people, and I'll probably mention their names as we proceed. First of all, I have to figure out how to advance on this little machine. Apparently Canadian technology is beyond me. Which is the advance button? Oh. In that direction. Aha! Okay, so there I think in this fabulous presentation that we've just seen from Pablo and Marcus, which I really, really enjoyed, we've seen images which I think predominate in many parts of the world about notions of suburbia, and yet there, in terms of suburban ways of living, the key argument that's being made is the increasing diversity of what suburbanisms may mean, which poses all sorts of methodological and conceptual, as well as basic research on the ground challenges. And that's certainly what we've been finding on the African continent. What we would generally call, with difficulties, suburbanisms are global phenomena. And in the African case, we've been trying to grapple with very rapid paces of change in which all sorts of new and diverse landscapes are emerging. So I will refer very briefly to cases as well as conceptual dimensions of suburbanisms. There is one published, there are one or two or three published things from our work so far, and there are others coming. One is an article which you can see referred to on the screen, which reviews really the last 10 to 20 years of literature on periphery suburbanisms and change in sub-Saharan African cities. I'm not going to speak quantitatively at all. I'm going to concentrate on qualitative views, on perceptions and ideas which are swirling around in the milieu of rapidly changing African cities. So let me ask you the question, whatever you think the category African cities, whatever that would mean now, whatever your images, in which, unlike the suburban scenes from Waterloo or Surrey, British Columbia, that we've just been looking at, or the south side of the river in the Montreal region, whatever your views may be there, what are your views of what constitutes the peripheries and other forms of suburbanisms in African cities? And for that matter, what will they look like into the future? Because the one thing we can be sure of is that they're changing very rapidly. Here's one image of the future of the African city. This happens to come from a large parastatal organization which generates electricity and is trying to expand its reach on the African continent. And that may not tie up at all with your image of the typical African city, if such a thing could be said to exist today. So it poses the question, where are we going? And what's the platform now from which we may get there? And to engage with that question, a historical view is definitely necessary. First point to make, if we look at an early 20th century map of African cities, I would guess the first point to make is that we need to recognize that Africa is the #1 continent in which the negative impacts of slavery and colonialism are still expressed. And these things are present in the consciousness of just about everybody every day, but in some respects, we're in a period in which old and new forms of colonialism and neocolonialism, old and new forms of investment, old and new forms of global connections are changing extremely rapidly. And one way of capturing that, en utilisant l'autre langue officielle du Canada, the boom of the cellular telephone in Africa. Let me draw your attention to Côte d'Ivoire on this map, which comes from Le Monde in Paris. And you will see that what it's telling us is that there is more than one cell phone per baby, 95-year-old, and every other member of the population in the former French colonial territory, with its recent civil war and all sorts of contemporary change in a country such as Côte d'Ivoire. And for me, that symbolizes some of the features of technological investment and all sorts of other changes with enormous impacts for almost everybody on daily life. Now, what I've chosen to do, because my particular case study in our project is based in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, is to show you some images of 5 different districts, 5 different neighborhoods or sections of Dar es Salaam. And let me just mention, this is not our only case study. Robin and colleagues are working in both Accra and Lagos. Alison Todes, who is somewhere here in the darkness relative to me, is working in the city of Durban or eThekwini in South Africa. Chloe Bui, who is here and will be presenting as well, is working in Luanda. Margot Rubin, Alison and I are working together in Johannesburg, and there are several other colleagues working in other African cities. But let me just look at Kimara, at Sinza, at Mlimani, at Mbezi Beach, and Msasani in Dar es Salaam, and to do this through pictures. Well, starting in Kimara, here we are about a little more than 15 kilometers from the historic center, to use that terminology, of Dar es Salaam. And what do we see? We're at the base, obviously, of a cell phone tower. And if we go to Google Earth, right at the bottom of that image, in the lighter color at the bottom of that image, that's the site on which my ground level picture was taken. What is this neighborhood like? Is this something that we could describe as part of global suburbanisms, 15 kilometers from the center of Dar es Salaam? Moving around a little bit on the ground, we find an extraordinary conglomeration of all sorts of dwellings and structures which are changing very, very rapidly indeed. And most of these buildings have only been here for a matter of just a couple of years, and yet the city has already expanded at least 5 kilometers beyond this zone. And here you see a fairly typical row of tiny apartments, if you like, rental space as well as home-owned space in these, what can I call them, suburban parts of Dar es Salaam. And the people who live in these spaces are generally what I would describe in very broad, very general, very dangerous, but I can't do much better terms, as proto-middle class. So here are 2 young guys who both have degrees, one in education, the other in urban planning. They are both either employed or likely to find employment. And one of them is living in 2 rooms with a kitchen, with running water, and just above the head of the man in the Timberland shirt, there's a piece of globalization for you, just above his head is a box on the wall. That's the pay-as-you-go electricity meter. And every single dwelling in this neighborhood is now connected to the grid. So we're not talking poverty extensively in the way that we used to in African cities, even though, of course, we're also talking about massive income distribution discrepancies and all sorts of other issues. If we get down to ground level in Kimara, we can see this extremely mixed environment. And you can see right in the middle of this particular picture that, again, digital technology is very, very important to the ways in which these areas are developing. Where is Kimara placed on a map of Dar es Salaam? It's more or less immediately above the name Mbezi that you see on this map, a confusing name because there's another Mbezi in Dar es Salaam. So it's out there, it's been on the periphery, it's become incorporated into an urban fabric, and it's continuing to change. So that yellow east-west road, Morogoro Road, let's take that road and head a little back towards the older center of Dar es Salaam. And as we go along Morogoro Road, we see the new kinds of investments which both public sector and private sector may be mutually engaged in. In this case, it's the construction of a bus rapid transit route along Morogoro Road with $100 million from the World Bank, amongst other things. And you see people know how to make use of temporary structures, of course. Every piece of space, every form of social interaction will be explored every day in a neighborhood like this. We build for you, says we are building for you, says the Kiswahili at the bottom of the sign here in Kimara. So we travel back, if you can call it back, towards the city. There's Morogoro Road on the south of this map. And the next picture is taken from the intersection, more or less, of Shekilongo Road. You can probably see the name, looking over this neighborhood called Sinza. 30 years ago, Sinza did not exist as an urban environment at all. In one generation, what you see before you has first of all been established and then begun to transmutate into something completely different, 5, 6, 7 kilometers from the historic center of Dar es Salaam. Here's Shekilongo Road. You can see how the commercial strip has developed along the road. You can see how even low high-rise, if I may call it that, medium-rise buildings have begun to appear. And that's telling you something about availability of services and all sorts of other issues. Oopsie. So looking down, getting a little more detail, when these sites were originally laid out with no services, people began to build simple houses. They became more elaborate over time, and in roughly the last 5 to 10 years, really dramatic physical change, architectural change, stylistic change, ways of life, forms of being, where to eat, where to shop, where to go, which centralities in the city. I think these things are captured very well in the case of Sinza. And some of it, as I've made the point, we're not just talking accumulations of poverty in African cities. How do people express newfound wealth in economies like Tanzania's, which is growing rapidly, let alone in countries like Ethiopia, where 10% growth each year for 10 years has obviously absolutely transformed the material resources available in a city such as Addis Ababa. So here we are in Sinza, and you can see we're not in the midst of shacks and squatters and informalities in the traditional form, right down to the level of trying to bring new character to the neighborhood through basic sub-ward or mtaa political structures. See the little street name sign on the street? That's new, folks. You didn't used to see that kind of attention to the neighborhood. So there's something going on. If we cross the road, if we go across Sam Nujoma Road, we find a major shopping mall, characteristic of many, many parts of the world. Is this really an export of American or Australian suburbanisms? I leave that to others to puzzle out. I'm having a little trouble with this control, but maybe we'll get there. Maybe it's just my lack of technique. With companies, the signs you see here are the names of companies from South Africa, but they might be from China, from India, from Canada, the United States, Germany, or anywhere else. And yet, across the road, we see what is imbricated with that apparent, in the crude phraseology, formality. In other words, there is diversity, but there is no absolute separation between the so-called informal and the formal. If we head out towards, in a sense, up the coast, heading northwards along Bagamoyo Road, out of Dar es Salaam, we find, what would I call it? A form of suburbia spreading along this road. And if we go towards the beach, this area is called Mbezi Beach, we will find places that are not so humble, places that are not so small. This is luxury suburbia in a variety of ways, and it's enormous in a city such as Dar es Salaam. Yet behind the beach, there's something else. This is an old quarry, an old borrow pit, as one version of English would have it. Completely illegal, utterly unregulated, not governed at all. And yet, the building materials for both the luxury and the illegal tend to come from exactly the same places, right there along Bagamoyo Road. So let's look down from the heights above Mbezi Beach, across the bay to the Msasani Peninsula. The Msasani Peninsula is where the British colonial officials were driving along Bagamoyo Road back in that direction. The Msasani Peninsula, seen here in a Google Earth view, is where British colonial officials were housed, where business people tied into the colonial world system, if you like, established themselves, separated themselves to some extent from other people in the past. It's where most of the foreign embassies are. It's where the Canadian High Commission is, amongst other things, and the Chinese embassy. What's happening on the ground in what looked like an area for a few generations, looked like an area of great stability and elite separation from the rest of the world? What's happened to plots like this, where this also fairly luxurious house is? But here we're back to about 4 kilometers from the center, the historic center of Dar es Salaam, not far from all that new strip development along Bagamoyo Road, which I've briefly shown you. Well, one stage of change, surprise, surprise, is higher densities at this kind of scale, in the semi-gated kind of row house or terraced, whatever you would call it, kind of complex. But as you cycle along the road, still an important means of transport, even though there are beginning to be more surfaced roads, ordinary cars can become more easily used. As we move around in this area, what do we find? Higher-rise apartments are appearing. They are being built by architects and global construction companies, and they are being decorated with, again, global forms of engagement. And they finish up looking just like the publicity brochures, and what's so different from condominiums on the waterfront of some well-known Canadian cities. But it's not only a residential space, it's also commercial and office space. Here's the signage for a new office building, which looks like this, same road, replacing one of those old luxurious houses. And once again, the digital technologies are pretty important. This is the South African version of Vodafone phones from the UK, very important in the development of Tanzanian capitalism, if you like. So is this suburban nirvana, which is being created for all? Maybe yes, maybe no. So we've had to consider meanings across these examples I've quickly suggested to you. Similar things, different things in Dar es Salaam, Luanda, Accra, Lagos, Durban. We've had to consider meanings and words. I'm going to put a lot of words on the screen now, and I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail. Some of this text comes from the review article to which I've already drawn your attention. And I'll simply say that we're wandering around trying to find the terms which will allow us accurately to describe in a way which is satisfactory to our understandings of what is happening in these suburbs. And remember, we're doing this across not only a group of major colonial languages, including Portuguese and Francais and English, we're also doing this across an innumerable number of African languages, through which one may think what these things are about. I would like to suggest to you, possibly in rather different kinds of ways. So our review indicates that words like suburbs need to be retained. Suburb, suburbanism. We have to find ways of fleshing out what we mean by these words and adapting them to the kind of pace of change which is taking place, at least in 3 different kinds of areas in Africa's cities. Changes at peripheries, changes concentrated in older areas, whether they're older elite areas like Msasani or older areas like Sinza that I've drawn to your attention. And we also have to look at the emergence of new centralities geographically, which are obviously related to changing patterns of suburbanism, changing patterns of daily suburban life. Issues of method, my view, to absolutely abbreviate here, is that one of our difficulties in Africa, which contains more people living in cities than either Europe or North America today, and that will only multiply, not as large as Asia, it's perfectly true, but rather significant, and yet the literatures, as I remarked to the review committee yesterday, maybe less than 1% of the size of the literatures on those other continents. So we need people who've had the educational opportunities in Canada or in Ethiopia or in South Africa or in Senegal, who can engage in diverse ways, in real ethnography, not superficial stuff, in surveys, using big data, using the techniques, beginning to find ways of applying the kinds of methods to which Pablo's drawn our attention so eloquently today. We're not yet close, but the Global Suburbanisms Project, like some others, the Global Suburbanisms Project is making a contribution in this direction. Lastly, what does all this mean for the ways we think cities in the world? What does it mean for the ways we think cities? As Terry McGee puts it in his chapter in Suburban Constellations, we're looking at increasing diversity and hybridity, which is both a strength and a challenge for new urban theory in the 21st century. We haven't yet solved the problem of generating these new understandings, but we think by holding hands with colleagues from Vancouver to Hong Kong, from Shanghai to Mexico City, from Dakar to Jakarta, we are beginning to make some very interesting progress. Of course, it's too early to say if we'll influence practice or policy, but through increasing connections and even partnerships with a variety of organizations, we may begin to help people understand, number one, urbanization is not going to go away, and also that suburbanisms are not likely to disappear in a hurry. And so from Africa's new suburbanisms, Alvin and colleagues, lives are changing fast. Places are not the image only of the informal, they are diverse. Words are not yet adequate, but we may be moving on. The images are still splintering, and the paradoxes are exactly what we've embarked on trying to explore. Asante sana, obrigado, que leboha, merci, thank you.
We have 2 wonderful keynotes that have provided a panoramic view of continuity and change and diversity and in the context of global suburbanism. And now we have plenty of time for questions and comments. I can't see.
Maybe people need lunch.
Don't be shy. Jump in.
Maybe crank up the house lights.
Yes.
Damn.
One way, there's one concept that's real, that other people have used to try to distinguish these different places is property and property rights. And you mentioned one really informal settlement where you said, I think everything is illegal. Is there a kind of dividing line between is most property in fact informal even in the wealthier districts? I mean, can you understand these places better with the concept of property, or does it make things even more paradoxical?
Should we collect? Why don't we collect a few
Okay,
observations or
collect a couple of
comments or
questions.
Is that okay?
If you don't mind, I would like to actually comment on what you just said a moment ago, and beg to differ a little bit. You mentioned that somewhere behind Daisy Beach there are people squatting within the...
Right there, right there.
Yeah, wonderful presentation, although I beg to differ on one little thing about that there are some illegal squatters to be found behind Mbezi Beach. In fact, everyone in Tanzania occupies land from the largest high-rise down to the most humble wattle and daub dwelling at the pleasure of the president. There is no formal freehold land ownership anywhere in Tanzania. And even the 1999 land reform laws did not change that. And basically, Tanzania only recognizes use rights, not actual ownership in a Western sense. And so it's pretty remarkable that in spite of all of that, such an infrastructure actually emerged.
Perhaps one more question to collect.
I'm just curious, Dr. Mabin, you mentioned you've done some qualitative work about Africa, and I'm curious, in your experience so far, which obviously is distraction Michelle making a plea. You're making a plea for a lot of us today to either ourselves or find others to go into Africa and do some of this research that's evidently so needed. Do you begin to see anything? We're so familiar with how suburbanism and the American dream are conflated in the United States. I'm curious if you're beginning to see anything similar to that in Africa, and the distorting effects that are so readily apparent here, or in the US, that is.
What about something for Pablo?
Oh, why don't we deal with
He's
you
much more
first
eloquent
and
than I am. Yeah, I mean, I really like the point about how you can have a situation of very established settlement completely in the absence of typical concepts of freehold or 99-year leasehold or whatever else the case may be. But that does not change the simple point that there are some places where use rights are approved, are regulated, whatever the corruption may be in the system, and every system of land rights that I've ever encountered from Texas to wherever else is corrupt at one level or another. So there's a difference between having properly established use rights in some parts of Msasani, for example, which you obviously know well, and some other parts of the environment of Dar es Salaam. So that brings us to the point that Professor Fishman is raising. Of course, the answer is no. The way people access, hold, exchange, transfer land, if that's the set of things we're talking about in relation to property, these concepts are absolutely critical. The kinds of changes that are going on in Sinza, in the section that I know best, which is called Sinza B, because I happen to know people in the Mtar committee there, the kinds of changes that are going on would not be possible without people having some form of security, which we might describe as property in one place or another. People would not be investing, let alone in the medium-rise buildings that you saw in brief images, but in the massive improvement of their own houses or in building an office block in the corner of a larger lot in that part of the world without. But of course, we also have to emphasize, and this is not unique to the African continent. One finds parallels in Mexico, one finds parallels in Canada for that matter. One has to emphasize customary forms of access to land, or traditional, or whatever terminology you wish to use, as well as what we sometimes distinguish, perhaps rather inchoately, between formal and informal ways of holding and transferring land. So no, I think there's a long way to go in developing our concepts, and I think you'll find, if you listen to some of my colleagues who are much more intelligent and well-informed than I am in some of their cases, that you'll see the ways in which these things are represented. And then quickly and lastly, do we see an African dream? And I would say yes. I would say that the possibility of large numbers of people really transforming the nature of their life and their insertion into the city, that's something that's growing incredibly fast in different cities on the African continent. That's not unique. One would obviously say the same in various parts of Asia. One would say, without question, that's partly what's happened over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years in Brazil, for example. So yes, and I think that understanding what everyday life in these places that we somewhat imprecisely describe as suburban, I think that's precisely a key concept that we need to explore further. So thank you very much for those points.
Pablo, did you want to?
Yay.
Thank you. Marcy Birchfield from the Neptus Foundation. Pablo, you're obviously the Atlas of Suburbanism is very much quantitative in the lens that you're looking at the suburbs, and very much based on sort of the data sources that are available in Canada. I'm just wondering, given sort of the situation that Alan's described and the rapid change in the African cities and other Asian cities, can you think about sort of a similar model of quantitative comparison given the data challenges, I guess, in these places?
We want to see if anybody else has questions. I can.
Ms. West.
Thanks a lot for the great presentations. A very simple question, which I'm always interested in. How would you describe the social and political purpose of the research that you do? Okay, since any research project and any theory has either an implicit or explicit set of such purposes.
Okay. Interestingly enough, the challenge of data is one that we will be experiencing here in Canada as well, as we have come to rely so much on the census, which has now been made much more thin than what it had been for many years due to the changes in the government's decision to not make the long form mandatory as part of the census. And so I think what this is going to do is my sense is that we're going to experience a period of enormous creativity in the part of researchers who are going to, we are going to need to devise new ways of creating reliable measures that are based on different strategies, methodologies of estimation when the data is much thinner than it is. And so I think that some of these advances, if we want to use that term, are going to be applicable to Canada, but also it's going to have as a side effect also, hopefully, greater interest in part of researchers to study other parts of the world and not just the places where data has been traditionally much more accessible. So I'm excited by that opportunity, although I am definitely disappointed by the fact that such an important resource is being withdrawn from us. In terms of the social and political purposes of the project, I would say for one thing, that being able to show the importance of having measures, of having ways of establishing what kinds of patterns have exist and how they have evolved over time is an important project in that precise context, to say that being able to have publicly accessible data, to be able to understand what is happening in our world or in our parts of the world is very important. And so I am hoping that through this project we can also bring visibility to that to that issue. But more generally, I think that being able to get a sense of the evolution of inequality in Canada and how this has taken new spatial forms is really important, not only for the local context, the Canadian or national context, but also as part of the larger global suburbanisms project, to be able to suggest different ways in which we can try to understand these evolving or changing geographies of inequality, be able to pay attention to ways of life that are very much connected with economic restructuring, being able to look at ideological, political patterns of voting, for example, and how these have new geographies because of the increasing diversity of metropolitan regions. And so I think in general, just the project of being able to show quantitatively through data visualization all these changing patterns, all these evolving issues is very important for, not just for understanding, but for further political action and engagement.
Perhaps I can pose a question to Professor Mabin. Building on your response to the emergence of an African suburban dream, could you talk about variations in the degree to which upward mobility translates to horizontal versus vertical separation, and at what scales that seems to operate in different African cities?
Yeah, I may have foolishly conveyed the impression that everybody is enjoying upward social mobility everywhere on the African continent, and we should only use the term suburbanism to refer to what we might loosely describe as middle-class forms of life in different parts of the city. That's not really an adequate way of thinking about what is happening. So if we take Chloe, where are you? Can I see your hand? There she is in the back. Chloe happens to be presently a postdoc at our university in Johannesburg, has been pursuing her research largely in Luanda. And I think she'd be extremely well qualified to talk about how processes cut in at least two, if not more, directions in a city such as Luanda. So some of the changes that are taking place in slightly older, more centrally, supposedly located areas, difficult word when centralities are changing so much, but that there, of course, are expulsions of people whose ability to cope with the political and economic circumstances in which they live may be, in a broad sense, declining, as well as the possibility that there is, as we've seen, and that's why I used the well-known Brazilian example, that we do see very significant numbers of people having access to considerably different income streams, different forms of accessing, amongst other things, land, as well as commodities, represented by the electronics and digital booms in various markets in Africa, for example. But I don't think that our research has, in our case, gone sufficiently far to be able really to provide more precise answers to your questions. And I think that my colleagues and I would probably take what you're saying as a stimulus, just as we, I think, being able to come here and engage, we may have seen some of the Atlas of Suburbanisms on Canadian metropolitan areas at a distance, but to begin to engage with some of the textures and the way in which the conceptual advances that are being made are related to not just the direct methodologies which the data has allowed to be deployed in this environment, I think we can also take the ideas that are emerging, new ideas that are emerging in that work, and take those into other environments, which would probably be true. Shubhra Gururani or Solly Benjamin, who represent here the Indian, the South Asian team in the Global Suburbanisms Project, I hope would concur with what I'm saying, that we can see new ways in which we can think about forms of change in those environments. So thanks for those points. May I just say, because I think this will be my last word in this session, it's an enormous privilege to be part of this project and to be sitting here. And I just want to express to this audience thanks particularly to Sarah MacDonald, who is really the backbone of what has allowed this project and this conference to proceed. And I believe there's somebody called Roger Kyle somewhere to be seen in the background, as well as all the other members of this project, yourselves included. And I just want to say thank you very much to those people and to Shirk for providing not the only source of funding, but the primary source of funding for what we're doing. Thank you very much.
So we have time for one more question. Yes.
My voice doesn't project very well, so I'm glad I have the microphone. You know, it strikes me just how similar the type of research the two of you are engaged in, especially when you're dealing with the informal aspect of suburban development in Canada. I can certainly see some of those settlements in Africa tied directly to informal basement apartments. And I'm wondering to what degree, I guess this is to Pablo, what degree do you feel that the data sources that you have in Canada are accurately capturing these kind of informal relationships? And how can some of that research, especially in the African context, be used to inform the Canadian one? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Incidentally, I wrote my PhD dissertation on basement apartments in Vancouver, so as it turns out, in 2006, the Census or Statistics Canada trained its enumerators to look for what might be basement apartments and to then make an effort to collect census information from residents in those suites. Now, of course, it is very likely that a considerable proportion of those apartments was not accounted for, and statisticians at Statistics Canada have attempted to make estimations of that based on other parameters. And so we do have some sense of what that is like. And it is in fact quite significant. In Vancouver, for example, it's about 10% of all the housing stock. It's estimated to be that large. And so I think it is very interesting. We haven't touched on that aspect of suburbanisms because until now. But I think it is very interesting because precisely of the increased incidence of rental housing away from the center. And so when we think about suburbanisms as ways of life, the issue of renting becomes more and more relevant, and whether that is happening in the more regulated type of dwelling or not is an issue. So it's a very interesting question. I'm glad you raised it. Again, creates a possibility for a conversation, as you suggested.
I believe that brings us to the end of our time for this panel, and I'd like to thank the panelists and the audience.
And all of you.
Thank you.